Well, here we are with a little story from back in the day. You know, I spent a lot of time working at the Ford dealership before I went to teaching, and then I spent other time before that. I really started my career working with my dad back in the real early 70s, late 60s. And whenever I would help him, you know, he didn't take a lot of time to teach me much, but I just learned by watching him. And I remember building that dune buggy. It's basically, you can look on my YouTube channel for this video called My Buggy and Theirs. I had built myself a dune buggy, and then there was pictures of me and my brother riding it, you know, back in the early 70s. And then we built another one almost just like it for my boys 23 years later, and there's video footage of both of those on there. So if you do a search for My Buggy and Theirs on my channel, you'll find it. Well, I'm going to get into this thing today. This happened a long time ago at the Ford place, but I had written a Motor Age article about it, and I had started writing for Motor Age in May of 2000, so I've got some stories that are kind of old. Hopefully this one won't bore you too much, but it was kind of fun. It was somewhat unusual, so I just figured I'd go ahead and give you a rundown on this one. I call this Smoke Search. This was a really nice little Ford Ranger that was had 126,000 miles on it. The repair order had the name of a local parts change store on it. So I wanted a clearer picture of what was going on, so I went to the service writer's desk to ask him what was happening. Sometimes the service writer didn't give all that good of information. You had to go ask more questions, get him to call the customer, that kind of thing, you know. Now, this was the service bay I was working in at that time. Alright, so he bought an alternator. He had installed it himself. He saw smoke coming from under the dash after he had run it a little bit. He blamed the new alternator because he hadn't seen any smoke before he put the new alternator on it. So the store sent him to me at the Ford dealer and said they'd pay for any damage the alternator had caused. So here we were, and it was really a noisy alternator. He had put the original alternator back on it. It was noisy, it was hot, and I could hear it from way off with the engine running. And so I put the new alternator on that he had bought. They sent me the actual alternator that he had bought and put on there because I needed that. And I connected the Mac tester, and whenever I was checking it, I saw good amperage, about 50 amps, that it was being put out by the alternator, but the voltage was reading just a little below 12, which I thought was very interesting. This is the kind of thing that you'll see on one of these. If you turn that carbon pile knob and put a load on it that pulls the battery voltage down, it's shooting for about 14 volts more or less, and so it's going to give a lot of alternator feel to it to bring the amperage up. This was showing 50 amps, okay? So anyway, that was what I just told you, so that was an unnecessary slide. So I had smoke. After I sat in the engine, sat in the seat for a little while, smoke came boiling out from under the right side of the dash, and I pulled the carpet down to see the inertia switch was all burned up and cooked and all. This was a little takeoff on the Monkees song, you know. So the inertia switch is supposed to shut the fuel pump off. Most people know about it. Fords have had it for a long time. Now, the newest model Fords is kind of built into the engine controller, but they had a little actual switch with a button on it that is on the vehicles, on the cars, it would be in the trunk. On the pickups, and it would be against the bulkhead above the carpet. On some of your SUVs, like on my 2006 Explorer, it's on the right side behind the kick panel over there. But like I say, they did away with it later. Now, it's also tied in on hybrid vehicles to the hybrid system and that kind of thing. And on some of them, it's actually, as I remember, it's tied into the airbag system on some of them too. But let's keep going. All right, sometimes the inertia switch will develop an internal resistance carrying the load of the fuel pump. It'll burn out. And I'd kind of seen that before. I hadn't really seen one burn out this bad, but I said, well, I'll go ahead and replace the inertia switch. It came with the switch, and it came with the connector and the terminals to go in the connector and all that, so that we could make it just like it was new again. And so that's what I did. I put a new inertia switch, did solder and heat shrink, hooked that up. Somebody else had already fixed those wires though. and I just had to go back and cut out what they had put in there and do it over again. Well, this was what was funny. After I fixed the inertia switch, I started it up again, and the next time I saw anything going on, it was under the hood. I'm looking out here, and I'm seeing flames under the hood. And I'm saying, good grief, what's going on out there? So I had to run over there and grab a fire extinguisher and put the fire out under the hood. And this is what I saw. It set fire to the fuel pump relay. I said, that's absolutely incredible. You know, that relay is made to pull about 30 amps, or carry about 30 amps. So I was just mind-boggled by that. So basically what I had to do was get my fancy little tool I've shown you before and put my heat shrink and all in a new connector, and I put a new relay and a new connector. That's my repair job there. You know, I tried to make it as close to factory as I could, which here's something you need to take with you where you go. Every job is a picture of the person that did it. Just remember that. It's really important. Okay. All right, so this was a really rare Ranger with dual tanks. The front lift pump was the one that was selected, and while it was running, it was pulling 50 amps. The circuit wasn't built to carry a 50 amp load, which I thought was pretty interesting how that worked. So I switched to the rear tank, and the current load was almost nothing. So he had a bad fuel pump in the front tank. The pump was able to run and move fuel. Now this was a lift pump that was feeding the one on the frame, if you remember. The fuel pump on the frame was, until 1990, these Fords had a fuel pump, a frame-mounted fuel pump, and then they had a little lift pump that was kind of like a windshield washer pump in the gas tank, but it was made to feed fuel. If the one in the fuel tank quit running, I mentioned this in a previous video, then sometimes the one on the frame would lose its prime. It wasn't as bad to happen on a car like a Mustang or a little LTD or something as it was on a pickup truck, like Rangers and F-Series pickups had a terrible problem. If the pump in the tank went dark, then it might run and it might not, and it would throw you for a loop if you weren't familiar with it. What I would always do is unplug the pump on the frame and then put my ear against the gas tank, have somebody switch on the key, and see if I could hear that pump in the gas tank humming. If it didn't run, I knew that where my problem was. Well, anyway, he didn't want to spend any money on this pump. But there's a fusible link right here. That's a fusible link there. It's got a special kind of wire. It's got high-poline insulation on it. It's a size smaller than the circuit is protecting, so that if anything happens on a steady load, it's a real, like a dead short or something, it'll burn that through. Well, this fusible link could actually carry 50 amps over a period of time without burning in two. It's not like a fuse, but it acts sort of like a fuse, but it actually takes a while before it burns in two. Alright, and so this is the path the current took, actually going through this switch, making its way out to the fuel pump, and then the fuel pump had caused it to, you know, cook all these connections and everything. So that was one of those things that sort of was mind-boggling. So this was coming together in my mind. I says, okay, we got melted connector here. Wasn't really melted bad enough to worry about. I did clean those pins off and all before I put all that back together. I mean, how much time do you really want to spend on this, huh? This was under the dash where it connected to the switch under the dash. You can see where it sort of melted that one a little bit too. But I always look for oxidation on those, and if it's not too terribly bad, I'll leave it alone. I put a new alternator. Well, I put the new alternator. I already had the new alternator on there, and that had smoked out the problem, burned up the weak links in the chain. There was nothing wrong with the parts house alternator. It worked better than the old one, which was probably destroyed because of the constant load. This was what it looked like when it was bringing the battery up after the when it was switched onto the rear tank. I had a truck one time that came in on this guy brought it in on a trailer, and it was a pickup with dual tanks on it. And he said that it quit running while he was driving, and so he loaded it on a trailer and brought it to us. And so as soon as I got in the truck, the first thing I did was look and see which tank it was on to make sure that, you know, I was aware of that. So I went ahead and cranked it up. It was on the rear tank. I mean, I'm sorry, it was on the front tank. I cranked it up, or I tried to crank it, and it spun and spun and spun, and I got out there and I was going to check everything, and after about 30 seconds of spinning, it started catching, and then it fired up. I never could get it to quit again. I drove it around, checked it, and looked into a bunch of other stuff. Didn't really have any codes or anything like that. And so I said, well, I don't know what to do with that, you know. So I called the guy and told him to come pick it up because I really didn't know. I wasn't going to just throw parts at it, you know. We did charge him a diagnostic. He came to get the truck, and whenever he cranked up the truck and drove it, he started to head out the front of the dealership on it. He came walking back in there and says it quit on me again. Right there at the stop sign, getting ready to pull out of the dealership. So I walked out there with him. I got in the truck. I looked at the tank switch. It was still on the front tank. And I says, well, let me ask you, did you do anything other than just crank the truck up and drive it to leave the dealership? He goes, oh, I switched it to the rear tank. And it died, and so I switched it back to the front tank, but it was still dead. He didn't tell me that before. I says, you've got water in your rear tank. Those pancake-shaped back tanks have a tendency to get a lot of moisture condensation in them, you know. And I says, you're going to need to get the water out of that back tank. And so I said, let me show you what I'm talking about. So with it on the front tank, I spun it for about 30 or 45 seconds. It fired up and ran. I held the fuel accelerator pedal up, flipped it to the back tank. It immediately started to die. I flipped it back to the front tank, and it managed to catch itself and come back. I said, you're pulling water out of that back tank, what you're doing. He messed me up because he was flipping it from one tank back to the other. He always had it on the front tank every time I saw it, but he had gone to the rear tank and then back to the front without saying a word about it. You know, maybe I should have caught that, but one way or another, he didn't want to do anything about that either. He was kind of like this guy here, you know, he figured he could just run off one tank. All right, test question number 1. Smoke coming from under the dash generally means what? There are a lot of burned wires. All the fuses have blown. At least one wire is overheated and burning. An alternator is bad. This is the right answer to that question. I'll tell you why. One 6-inch long piece of wire, if it burns for whatever reason inside the vehicle, it'll fill that whole cab up with smoke. And it'll make you think the entire wire harness has been destroyed. One of the things you need to remember, though, is the smoke that comes off those wires is extremely toxic. So you need to roll the windows down, get the car doors open, get out of the car if something like that happens, because it can be really poisonous to breathe that wire smoke. What turns on the voltage regulator on an older Ford charging system? We have covered this before. That's going to be the voltage coming through the indicator lamp bulb and circuit. If that wire is cut, if that wire is shorted to ground, I had one time, a rental car that came in. Charging system wouldn't work. Alternator light wouldn't work, and so basically when I hooked the test light up to the wire, you let my test light be the indicator light, the alternator came online, took the instrument cluster out. There's some yo-yo had rented the car, and he didn't want to pay for the extra miles, so he took the odometer apart and he rolled the miles back on the odometer, and while he was fooling around in there, he ripped the printed circuit, and that kept the alternator from putting out. Well, they never could really get the guy for, you know, tampering with the speedometer because they could only prove he did it, even though he was the only one that had been in the car. Anyway, logically, what conditions would prevail if the charged battery lamp wire was severed but not shorted to ground? Well, the charging system wouldn't operate, the battery light would never come on, both B and C. Here's the other thing. If that wire is shorted to ground between the battery light and the alternator, the battery light will be on, but the alternator won't put out. And so that can trip you into throwing an alternator on it. That doesn't happen a lot, but it's a possibility. What purpose is served by the inertia switch? It shuts the fuel pump down for no apparent reason sometimes to... No, that's not what it does. It cuts power to the fuel pump in the event of a collision. Sometimes when people slam the trunk on their car or somebody actually kicks the inertia switch with a big old boot, it'll cause it to die. You know, once again, if you switch the key on and you don't hear the fuel pump on a Ford, some Toyotas have got inertia switch, some Nissans have got inertia switches, Chevrolets and Dodges, as far as I know, have never had them. But anyway, always think about the inertia switch, find out where it's at, see if it's tripped, find out if it's got one to begin with. When the inertia switch connector melts down and causes an open circuit, it usually means, well, when the button's up, it's tripped. Terminal oxidation causes resistance, but causes enough heat to destroy the switch. That's usually what's going on there. Now, it can be that there's a high current load somewhere on the circuit. So basically, there's 2 possible right answers for that question right there. When the inertia switch is found to be melted, what should be done next? You replace the inertia switch. You don't bypass it, but you also, I would investigate this if it was melted bad enough. If it's just melted because it's oxidation and stuff, that don't usually mean there's a current overload, but it never hurts to check that, right? What's the best way to splice wires in an automotive circuit? Tie them together and tape them? No butt splices, no Scotch locks, solder and good quality heat shrink, best way to do it. One good way to isolate a short or high current load, if you don't have an FLIR camera, you got to isolate parts of the circuit by unplugging connectors all along the way, checking the circuit after each connector is unplugged to see if the short goes away. And that's how you do that. You don't want to increase the current because you may burn something up if it's in a situation where it's a fusible link's the only circuit protection it has. Alternator from the parts store smoked out the problem, made it worse by increasing charging system performance. It wasn't the part store or the alternator's fault. And there's your fusible link. It's always one size smaller than the circuit is protected, and you don't replace it with a regular wire. You basically are wanting one. One of the things that irritates me is some of these parts houses will sell fusible link wire that's got Hypalon insulation on it, which is insulation that won't melt typically. And it'll just have regular copper wire in there, and it runs really hot all the time. I don't really like that. This fusible links were really expensive if you buy one from a dealer, but that is a special kind of wire, and so you got to keep that in mind too. All right, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this. It's not very long, but I'm going to try to post one of these every week if I can find the time to do it. Sometimes I get busy with my writing and editing and stuff that I do. But send me any feedback that you might have. I doubt this will help you fix any 2020 model cars, but just anyway, give me some feedback if you want to. If not, that's okay too.